Hello, everyone. This is Robert Wood, and this is the Security Program Transformation Podcast. I am joined today by my good friend, Gunnar Peterson, and I'm going to turn it over to him to let Gunnar introduce himself so I don't steal all of his thunder. So please take it away, sir.
Thanks, Robert. It's good to be here and good to talk to you today. So for my background, I'm currently CISO at Forder, which is a trust platform for digital commerce. Before that, I was Chief Security Architect, Bank America. And before that, did a lot of security consulting on everything from payment systems to the early days of cloud security, web application security. Application security is a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. So really looking forward to it.
Yes, sir. And one of the things I love about Gunnar is, so we intersected years ago at Cigital. So Cigital was, for anyone that doesn't know, one of those OG AppSec firms. And we ended up working together on several big, what we referred to as architecture risk analysis projects. That were basically like you went in and just kind of rolled up your sleeves and got nasty with an application, and like figured out all the ins and outs and the data flows and where it was going to break and fall over and all of that. And I learned a ton from this man and very much look up to him. And so one of the things I found most interesting and why I was very excited to have this conversation is that you have worked in very, very large environments and very, very small environments. And I've done the same throughout my own career, and they are very, very different in terms of org politics and budgeting and how things get prioritized and all the things. And so thinking about application security, which has been around for a while now, but interestingly is still seems like somewhat of an emerging field in terms of truly grappling with the skills needed to do AppSec right. I wanted to ask, from your perspective, if somebody was starting out the process of building an AppSec program or an AppSec initiative, what do you think are the highest ROI, return on investment activities that they should be thinking about first? And thinking about that, contrasting from the very, very large environment that probably has a bunch of legacy technology, legacy process, legacy people, even, to the emerging products technology company, which I would put Forder kind of in that category now of just more bleeding edge, single or small product footprint company.
Yeah, I think, you and I have both been doing this for a long time, like you said, and I don't know about you, but I suspect that similar to me, when we started out, we probably thought a lot about technology. We thought about the tools. We thought about the code doesn't lie sort of view of the world, which is true. And you need good technology. You need good tools. Certainly need quality code. But one of the things I appreciated about your work over the years and that you've shared publicly is your focus on the human side of cybersecurity as much as any of the technology side. So it's fair to say, I think my world has evolved from looking really super deep into the technology and that being the driving force to like, how do you scale this in a real live organization? And to your point, it is a different game if you're talking about 2 or 3 developers versus 20 developers versus 200 developers versus 2,000 developers. Those are not the same shops. They could be writing the exact same line of Python right now, but the way that those things get put into a build pipeline, the way that they get deployed, the outputs of those, the ecosystem in which they exist is really totally different. And certainly when it comes to securing them, it's totally different. So I think that a healthy way to start is like, where are you? I think it's important for teams to have a not a skeptical mindset in the sense that they don't want to be skeptical about what can be achieved, because everyone can really improve their application security with a little bit of work. You can make some pretty large improvements in a short amount of time, but also don't assume that this is an easy problem. So first understand, where you are, and don't assume that it's an unsolvable problem, but don't assume it's the hardest problem. It's not the hardest problem, it's not the easiest problem, but start with understanding where you are. What's your ratio of application security people to developers is an interesting question, and back to that two person team, 20-person team, 200, 2000. You'll end up with different things. So I think the first principles I always like to start with is, from a risk standpoint, is coverage and efficacy. What parts of a pipeline, what parts of a dev tool chain are you going to cover, and what are all the places you can play? There's 3, 4, 5 different parts of the build pipeline that you could probably think of going after first, from like dependency scanning to checking repo permissions to, to scanning on the outbound side. Like there's a whole set of things you could do. Which ones are you doing now? Which ones, and this is the second question, efficacy, which ones do you think you're actually doing a good job with? And like, it's really important not to, this is where the skepticism is really important. You're running a tool, great. Is somebody consuming the tool output? Is somebody making decisions differently than if the tool wasn't running at all? Is everything a high? Is everything a low? Is everything a critical? Like these are signs of a system that's probably not working. And so I think the basic answer to your question is it starts with coverage and efficacy. My feeling is that most teams are served better proceeding from there and thinking almost in Lego block by Lego block terms, where don't do 5 things halfway, pick one thing, maybe 2 things at most, and try to feel like you have that problem nailed down tight. Maybe it's container scanning, maybe it's a golden build, maybe it's dependency scanning. I think you can make different arguments depending on where you are at in your organization and your business model and stuff like that. I would tend to say that scanning on the outbound side is my default starting point in terms of making sure I have a really good understanding of the output of the build pipeline and the health and quality of those products and the findings that we're getting out of those products. There are 100 ways it can go wrong left of that. But the product of all of this is something that's going to be manifested on the right-hand side of that build pipeline. And so I think starting from that side and then finding what the next part left of that would be, which doesn't mean left adjacent. It could mean all the way back at the beginning of dependency scanning or something, but like doing that next thing really well, one by one, rather than I've seen teams fail by doing a pretty good job at 5 things instead of a really good job at 1 or 2.
Yeah. Now, the reason I love that answer is it really touches on the process dynamics in building an AppSec program. And this was something that I personally fumbled the ball on when I stepped out of Cigital into the startup ecosystem, is thinking about coverage. That was one of the things that I over optimized on coverage, trying to have too many balls in the air instead of really pinning down a few things and doing them supremely well. And over time you fumble the ball and you learn and you get a little bit better at your job, and hopefully the years go on, you get more gray hair, and you're a little bit better with each gray.
Yeah, the one I like on that is good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. That's
I love that.
So you have to have the humility to you can only get the good judgment if you recognize through humility where you actually had bad judgment in the first place.
Yes, that is very meta. That might be the quote takeaway from the show. Now, if you were in an organization, because in especially in a product organization, you've got engineers doing a lot of the work that ends up resulting in security. It's not necessarily the security team doing these things. It's the security team evangelizing or supporting or building some sort of scaffolding or tooling that engineers use, but ultimately the engineers end up driving a lot of the progress and the outcomes. Now, if they were, let's say if you were to measure the overall, the efficacy of a given activity on a 1 to 10 scale, if you were at, say, a 7 or 8, something like that, on a given activity. Let's say you've got two things, DAST and SCA, dynamic scanning and library scanning for anyone who's not tracking. And you were at a 7 or 8 of efficacy on those two activities. Would you recommend, and of course, like everything in security, it's an economics game on some level. And so you're choosing to invest your time and focus and money sprint over sprint, quarter over quarter. Now, would you really try to optimize those two activities before you take something else on? Or I guess, when is enough from an efficacy standpoint in your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think coverage is part of it. And, one thing we didn't touch upon is that, coverage can be looked at really two different ways. There's coverage of like, here are all the things I'm doing as an enterprise. Let's take Uber, right? Like, I don't know how many applications run inside of the Uber incorporated, ecosystem, probably hundreds or thousands. But there's one that I'm pretty sure needs to work really well every time, which is the rideshare app and the payments app, right? So knowing what your crown jewels are, the coverage that you might go after could be deeper in your crown jewels that's different than the rest of your enterprise writ large. So there could be a way to slice that answer a little bit more thinly. I think when it comes to efficacy, one of the things I like about doing less stuff and doing it better, to put it simply, is it also helps you with developer engagement and working with developers, because it's the way most of your developers think. Like, why am I doing this thing? Engineers wake up to solve a problem. They don't wake up to partially solve a problem. They wake up to solve a problem. And so, pushing that, all else equal, and all else is not always equal, but pushing that 7, 8, or 9 to a 9 or a 10, sometimes that can be the best way to get a developer engaged. It also is pushing your advantage in the sense that you have people who know how to run those tools and know how to run those processes, whether it's DAST or SCA. All else equal, I'd probably say it's DAST. Just because that's going to be the closest thing to the runtime and the closest thing to what a real attacker is going to see. So I think the tiebreaker in that argument that I would use is really about exploitability, reachability, the ability of a threat to take action on any flaw that you have. Every piece of software that everybody has ever written, certainly every piece of software I've ever written, has some number of vulnerabilities in it. That by itself isn't interesting. What's interesting is the ones that can be exploited, the ones that are going to make a really, really bad day. I think those are thankfully a lot fewer. They're certainly not zero. So finding the place where you can wield the right tool at the right time is where I would go with that.
Okay. Now, does that answer change at all in a bigger federated environment, which, like Bank of America, I would put into that category? Any big enterprise that has centralized IT or security resources, developer teams spread across business units, you've got more hierarchy, more bureaucracy just naturally in play. And CMS is very much like this. Like we sat in the Office of Information Technology, which had some software development happening, but most of the action happened out in what was referred to as the centers and offices. So healthcare.gov and the Office of Program Integrity and all of that good stuff. And so that was all an out there problem. And so we had to find these ways of bridging the gap between an activity we wanted to drive home and the way that we engaged developers who were loosely under our same organizational structure, but were really far away. And it's harder to reach farther across an organization in, just thinking through red. It's like literally swimming through a sea of red tape. And so I'm curious if your answer, if you would apply the same answer in the same decision process in that bigger federated environment.
It's a great question. I do think an enemy of security is when it can become going through the motions. And so I don't think this is true of most compliance activities, but there are organizations where certain compliance activities are received as going through the motions and check the box activities. And I think the time in which you feel like anything that you as a security engineer, leader are prescribing feels like a check the box activity, it probably should be a wake up call to say, like, I'm probably on the wrong track here. And I think that becomes much more prevalent the larger the organizations become. So in a small organization, if you and I decided tomorrow to start a cloud startup, we go and build a product, and someday we say we want to show this to customers, and then we say we have to have a SOC 2. It wouldn't feel like a SOC 2. I don't think would feel like a check the box activity. It would feel like, hey, this is what we're putting our big boy pants on now as a company, and we're trying to get something up and running. But you scale out to hundreds of thousands of people, means hundreds of thousands of middle managers, hundreds of thousands of regulations, and then there are things that feel like check the box activities. And I think security is too important, frankly. Like, information security, cybersecurity is too important to be a check the box activity. So any organization has a limited number of budget for security, a limited number of resources to throw at it. One of our jobs is to make sure, like, every dollar we spend, every hour we invest from our team is used for the highest and best use that it can from a risk perspective. That's what we should know better than anybody else. And because it's in a regulation, it means we have to pay attention to it, and we have to satisfy it. But we also need to look at the overall risk to find out where, the lion's share of the investment is going to go to addressing, application security or any other risk. And I think larger organizations make that a little bit more difficult. The goal I would go for always in a large organization is leverage. And this is something that I don't know if you've ever seen it. I've never seen it talked about in a security book or a security, Ross Anderson, dearly departed Ross Anderson, Matt Bishop, Gary McGraw, wonderful ideas, tons of technical ideas. All my ideas that I built my early and middle parts of my career on came from them. And leverage was never one of the things that anybody mentioned, right? So, like, how do I put in X and how do I derive 2X or 3X out of that resource? And I think that's the friend that you can try to make in a larger organization, where in a federated world, maybe it's about getting a super strong identity provider that is fed via SCIM or some automated provider that it mandates your authentication policies in the exact way that you want them and provides the highest quality identity the rest of the organization can have. Like, there are ways to scale certain things. Not everything in security scales, but starting from an XY axis where maybe the X axis going left to right is strength, and we're trained as security people just to go stronger on that X axis. That's what we're trained to do. We've got passwords. Well, let's make complex passwords. We got complex passwords. Well, let's make them MFA. We got kind of crummy MFA because it's SMS. Let's make it, Google Authenticator, like phishing resistant. So, like, that's the entire canon of security literature, is like how to move left to right on the X axis. I would argue in any organization, and specifically in large organizations, there's a Y axis. That Y axis is scale, and how many people, applications, assets in your organization are using the highest rightmost part of that X axis that I just figuratively drew. And probably it's not 100%. So then the question is, how do I move at the same time I'm moving left to right on the X axis of strength? How am I moving from bottom to top in scale? And those are different things. And there's less things, frankly, that scale, and a lot of security stuff just doesn't scale very well. So I think the discipline you can have as a senior security person is take a hard look at your risk, take a hard look at your capabilities, like I said at the beginning, and then say, which of these actually scales well? And that's probably the place you should start thinking about, I'm going to get the most juice out of this lemon by squeezing and getting as close to 100% scale as I possibly can on 3 capabilities across the organization. I think that'll work in large organizations. That'll work in medium-sized organizations. Smaller organizations, probably not as big of a problem, to your point. But even medium-sized organizations have this problem.
Yeah, big time. Big time. And not to brag, but I just got delivered some fresh baked cookies, and I'm very
geez. Must be nice.
Unexpected treat. So the point about leverage, and I agree with you. I have not read that in anything. The only person who I can think of who is this intentional around getting things done is probably Phil Venables, the blogs
Absolutely.
that he such, and he's obviously very steeped in organizational business dynamics as they relate to security. And so I don't know personally if he has ever talked about this, but it wouldn't surprise me. He's one of the few people who I could see talking about that y-axis and how to take advantage of it. And so this was something that we wrestled with a lot at CMS when the Executive Order 14028 came out. And that was basically the big zero trust executive order. So President Biden puts out this executive order saying everyone's going to do zero trust, among other things. And so everyone has to figure out how to jump through the zero trust hoops and to do it quickly, to have a plan. And so for us at CMS is a very large enterprise. And the way we thought about leverage was looking at shared services. So how many identity providers, for example, how many systems or parts of the organization were using a particular identity platform? How many were in a particular cloud hosting environment? How many were using golden images or EDR or some kind of shared resource where we could push our security configuration into those things, even if it didn't get us all the way down the path on the security maturity scale. We were able to get, if we have limited resources, $10 million or whatever, and we put 5 million of it into this one place, we're able to get 80% coverage across the enterprise. Was kind of the way we were breaking that problem down. And that's not an easy problem to solve. It's also something that I think speaks really directly into the need for having relationships and figuring out how to engage people in things that matter. And the thing I wanted to jump into next was on effectively engaging developers in the security process, because and I think it's useful maybe to think about not just engaging software engineers or full stack engineers, but engaging product teams, because you might have infrastructure engineers, you might have DBAs, you might have a product manager who's the one responsible for maintaining a backlog and doing sprint planning, prioritization, and all of that stuff. And from your background, have you found any particularly useful approaches or tools or conversations to have with these different individuals or roles in terms of getting them engaged on security activities?
Yeah, I mean, I think understanding the culture is a thing, and what works at Netflix may be exactly the right thing for your company, and it might have nothing whatsoever to do with your company. And it's really on you to figure out where, not just is this a good idea for some dev team, is this a good idea for my dev team? And probably for most of the people watching this, it's my dev teams, because you have one team in New Jersey, and you have one team in California, and you have a team in India, and you have a team in Australia. Like you might have 3 or 4 teams spread. If you really look, you might have a couple teams around the world. So I think figuring out who you are as an organization, who your dev managers are, what are your dev managers incentivizing their team? What are they hearing? So the top down view is helpful. The bottom up, you have to have. And I don't think there is a developer worth their salt that wakes up out of bed and wants to create vulnerabilities. They don't frequently know what app security and secure coding practices are, but they don't intentionally want to create them. So you have a knowledge gap, number one. You might have a skills or a tools gap. And, frequently we as security people will start with tools, but it's probably a knowledge and awareness gap more than anything. And once you get, skipping ahead to how we're going to solve this, Robert, once we get them engaged, your best developers will be, if they're fully enrolled in the problem of application security, they will be better than any tool anyone has ever created to finding and rooting out vulnerabilities you didn't know existed and finding effective ways to deal with them. So to me, it's a hearts and minds campaign for the heart of the engineer. And nobody wants to be the person who built a bridge and the bridge fell down. But I don't think that many average developers fully believe all of the things that come out of security teams' mouths. And the second you flip that bullshit detector, you're probably not going to get a second or third chance, which goes back to what I said at the beginning, doing a few things and doing them better. So I would much rather come with 3 known vulnerabilities than, 23 vulnerabilities and then, 5 of them turn out to be true positives. Because you'll lose people everywhere along the way. You have to respect that these people are working many, many hours. And especially if they're getting ready to ship a big release and things like that, that's the time you want to be working with them. That's also the time where you're putting a tax on their time. You're asking them to stay nights and weekends and things like that. Obviously, you need to do all of these things, but you have to do it in a way that works in your culture, works in your organization. And you better not be asking people to work nights and weekends on false positives. That is really not going to be a winning strategy. I always say security teams can win any one battle. There's no world in which security can't have a 1-0 record. The question is what happens in the second game, the third game, and the fourth game, right? You can ram that list of 23 vulns down somebody's throat and make them stay nights and weekends and fix it. And if it comes back with 3 true positives or 1 or, heaven help us, 0 true positives, then, and it also, think about if you're rooting for true positive, for true positives, that's also not good. But, you have to know that these tools are working the way you want them to, that they're designed, that they're tuned, that they're pointed at the right targets, and that the results they're producing are something that is worth your team investing in. And I think when you do that, you get credibility. And when you don't do that, you lose credibility so fast, and it's so hard to get back.
Yes. And the tuning, I think, is really an important part of that, and something that is so often cast aside or looked over. And I wanted to ask about this blurred line that has been happening between cloud security and application security. And at least in my experience, I've observed a lot of uses for the term security engineer or engineering in a security context. And despite that, I have not come across that many people who really truly understand the way enterprise software is built, or maybe not even enterprise software, but the way product is built and designed and released and operated and monitored, all of that stuff. And, we have this rise of DevSecOps, DevSecOps as a skill, as a job classification, as a set of tools, whatever it is. Yet, I think a lot of that is really focused on people who are, they understand cloud orchestration and deployment and all of that. So it's almost more cloud formation, Terraform focused, as opposed to the application tier, even though both are technically like as code in this world that we're moving into. But where do you see, or do you feel like do you see there being a blurry line between cloud security and application security, or do you feel like the lines are still pretty clear, yet the fact that we've merged them from a architecture standpoint, do you think that that's started to confuse things around security engineering and what that means? Because I think, and I guess the where I'm going with all of this is you'd mentioned a couple of things in your last response that I really wanted to pull on a little bit. One was the tool tuning, and I think it's really easy for us to start to skim over all of that in this more deterministic world of cloud security as opposed to application security. And then two is your point about showing up with credibility and bolstering that and continuing to gain trust and whatnot. And I think when we're talking to a software engineer and we don't understand code, that is a really, you're skating on thin ice in that situation. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I know that there is a lot of conjecture and layers of questions in that, but I wanted to get your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, I mean, so on the first point, is there blurred lines between cloud security and app security? I think if anything, you undersold it. I think these are so blurred at this point. It's I don't even know where and how those structural separations will reemerge from. Like, I think they're gone at this point. I think they're into people's titles. They're in people's brains. They're in like what I think my job is today. But I think as a security person who's like has to defend things in the cloud, let's say, those distinctions are so arbitrary. Like it's Terraform and it's infrastructure, or this is an app, or this is a product. Like they're either assets, they're vulnerabilities, or they're threats, and it's all attack surface. And they all, look at the Capital One breach as an example, and and that's obviously a very strong security team for a long time.
Yeah.
There was a hole, and I don't have any inside information, just based on the public reports. There was one hole that somebody didn't find, and then there was a blast radius that was due to a handoff between an identity token and an SSRF. And so, like, was that SSRF a application vulnerability? Sure. Was the identity scheme behind it an infrastructure vulnerability? Sure. Was the and you get this 1 + 1 = 3 scenario of a massive blast radius very quickly. So I think it's not something that I don't see it solving itself anymore. I don't think security can really solve that problem. And I think that whether it's a good thing or a bad thing at this point doesn't matter. It's the way the world is. I think our antidote actually in security is to blur the lines ourselves. And the lines that I would like to blur or try to blur in my own thinking and teams and tools is, like, I think we should be thinking 90% of the time like purple teams. And by which I mean, we want to, as security people, the extra sauce that we bring to the table, the extra value add, is on the blue team side, we should know our assets as well as our developers. Like, showing up to a developer and you don't know how the code is written is bad. Showing up, not knowing your APIs, not knowing, how your authentication scheme works. Like, know the blue as well as you can, and 80, 90 to 100% as well as the developers should be the goal. But that's not enough to call yourself a security person. You have to understand the threat side. You have to understand threat intelligence. You have to understand exploitability. You have to understand remote access, those sorts of things, as well as the red teamers do, and the types of tests that you can run. And then the purple team is really, of course, blending those two together. So I think we should, I don't know what to wish for in that first part of your question, like AppSec versus ProdSec versus CloudSec. Like, I think that's just happening. And our job is, we can spend a bunch of time worrying about that, but I think we should be blending our own worlds as fast as that world is blending on the assets that we have to defend side. We should be blending the red world and the blue world and thinking and operating as much like purple team as much of the time as possible. And, so to give a concrete example, when I think purple team, one of the things I think about that's really important is shortening the mean time to detect and shortening the mean time to remediate. So like those things are never zero, obviously, but where the purple team can really, really help is understanding what are the things that you're monitoring, what are the real threats, how do I detect things faster, how do I remediate things faster? Those are things like you can really build a practice around, and you can even, those metrics specifically, you can report them up the chain, right? It's budget time. People are asking for budgets. If you can show somebody a number, like what your boss wants to know is, if I give you 20% more this year, what do I get? If I take 20% away, what do I lose? Like, security teams have a really hard time, justifiably so, answering those questions. MTTD, MTTR they're not everything, but as a metric to index the health of your organization on, it's not a bad start. And to do that, you have to think like a purple teamer.
Okay. I like that. I like that answer. And what I'm getting out of that is the security person, the engineer working in security, needs to be effectively broadening their skill set so that they can work across all of these boundaries, from detection and response to proactive software or infrastructure protection, and be able to communicate across these boundaries. Because historically, the way that we organized not only big organizations, but security teams is very siloed. And you've got penetration testers and the SOC and the compliance people, and you have a really hard time speaking across those silos and understanding one another. And
it's not that those silos don't exist for good reasons. Like, we'll still have penetration tests. Obviously, we still need to do them. But the key thing is, like, how do you harvest the good bits out of that and make it as useful as possible, as quickly as possible, right? So there's still optimization in those certain areas. And this isn't really like, how do I build a career in information security kind of chat, but like, if you're starting out, you're probably doing really good if you get good as a blue teamer or get really good as a red teamer. Like, there's lots of careers to be started in each of those areas. I just think as a practice, the evolution, just like DevSecOps is blending lines, purple team is about blending lines. That's a mindset that you can build your practice around, and you can find tools and service partners that can close the gaps wherever you have the gaps. Maybe they're in a silo, one or the other silo. Maybe your gap is crossing the silos, and trying to find, tools and service partners that can help you close those gaps is perfectly good. Like, nobody's going to be 10 out of 10 at all of these things.
Yep. That makes a whole lot of sense. So, double clicking into this one last time, we've had this emergence of posture management tools. It's started with Wiz, well, maybe not with Wiz, but started it heavily in the cloud security space with CSPM. Now we've got SSPM for SaaS security posture management. We've got identity posture management tools. We've got data security posture management, and I want to talk about that later. And we've got
we're starting to sound like yoga.
I know it's true. And so thinking about ASPM in particular, the way I've seen most of these solutions work is they're almost like wrappers around all these other things that exist in the AppSec space, all these scanners and tools and things like that. Do you think that those tools are emerging and successful because of skill gaps in and around the application security specialist, or is there really just things moving so quickly and fluidly that we need these kind of middlewares to facilitate doing application security at scale?
I think the and I wrote I wrote a Substack. We maybe we can put it in the chat. So defensible systems .substack.com. We put a post out on DSPM, data security posture management, which is another one. But I agree with your characterization. It started with CSPM, and Wiz has obviously been a success story, and there's other success stories in that space. What I think CSPM did that was so helpful for the industry, and it ties to the purple team mindset that I talked about earlier, is it took a traditional outside-in view that InfoSec teams have had since the beginning. We put a firewall, we have a DMZ, we're bad stuff on the outside, good stuff on the inside, and we'll monitor this DMZ pattern. So CSPM started with that kind of structural outside-in security, and it added the killer feature, which is the attacker graphs, and that really gave you the simulated red team plus the blue team view, and you really have a start of a purple team in practice, which is really a big leap forward for the industry as a whole. By contrast, data security posture management, and I wrote about this in the piece, takes what I would call a revolutionary approach. Like, it's really difference in kind, not just difference in degree, where they're taking similar things that the CSPM folks are doing and running them from the inside out, starting with the data, trying to figure out where you're sensitive, PHI is, PII, et cetera. So now we've got two really successful spaces, and all of these contenders also starting to call themselves posture management, because marketing and product people are nothing if not observant. And so they're very quick to label things as posture management. You and I have been in AppSec for a long time. And, I remember in the early days of identity, somebody would put $1 million into an identity tool, and then they'd put $2 million of services into making it work. And you'd get these 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 ratios of service to licensing costs. AppSec was not dissimilar, right? People would buy the Fortifys and the Ounce Labs of the world, and then spend many hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to tune these systems to get them to work and get the value out of them.
Yep. Roll them out, tune them, figure out what to do with the results, feed that into vulnerability management, policy, procedure, all that good stuff.
And what I would call scale, right? Like, scale means like I can use it, point, click, and go across the enterprise. And I don't know that AppSec has a particularly, as an industry, this is a 48-point font statement, not a statement on any particular implementation. There's many good implementations of AppSec programs out there, but as an industry as a whole, I don't think it's done a very good job of, like, you can peanut butter this across an entire organization and without breaking a lot of systems in the process. So I think AppSec has been around for a long time, is still searching for a huge winner. It doesn't have a whiz in AppSec. There isn't really a winner to that level of success in terms of adoption and everybody runs it type of thing. And so now they've jumped on board this posture management, ASPMs. Is there a place where that could work in AppSec? Absolutely. I would be wary of people just rebranding, like putting old wine in new bottles and rebranding things as AppSec posture management. The bright line I would look for is this: like, what are you bringing me today that I didn't get already out of your tool? And is that more in the case of the attacker graphs in CSPM? Does that mean that I get attacker context? Does that mean I get true reachability analysis, not just SCA? Like, who can get to this library, and is it hanging out there on the internet, and is it available behind authentication or not authentication? And can you walk through some part of my control matrix and tell me if any of the 3,000 controls I've put in place is going to block this or not? And if you can do that, then I think it really is posture management. And I don't expect anybody to be able to do that day one out of the gate in all cases, but like, that's the direction of travel that I would want to see before I'd say, like, that's going to be a viable space. It certainly could be, the fact that nobody has really put that team on the field yet makes me think that it might be harder than some people think. But I think that's a direction that people can go. And, you're even starting to see Wiz and some of the other CSPM leaders put out code level systems. So we'll see what happens. I think the cloud gives you some advantages that we didn't have in the old days. And to go old school for a second, I didn't put this in the bio, but I wrote the first API security top 10 for OWASP. And I was frustrated. This was probably 12 years ago, something like that. I was frustrated because the API security vendors would take the OWASP top 10 and plunk it down and say, well, we're using HTTP, so we might as well use the OWASP top 10 to assess our API security. Well, the OWASP top 10 had things like cross-site scripting. It had some stuff like SQL injection, which still applied to APIs. But it also had a ton of stuff like cross-site scripting and JavaScript, things that probably didn't really apply as much or sometimes at all to APIs. And you missed a very important behavioral aspect with APIs, which is in web applications, you knew what a browser was supposed to do. Chrome, Firefox, Safari are supposed to do this, this, and this. They're supposed to handle a session cookie that way. APIs are written because you don't know what the client is. You wouldn't have an API if you know what the client was. You would just have an application which just do the job. So APIs only exist because you don't know what the client's doing. Hence, how do you actually take the things that you assume the browser is doing, put that burden of secure storage and secrets management and initial authentication and what identity protocols, that needs to be in play. The cloud, for all the problems that you rightly pointed out about the cloud and the blurring of the lines of the DevSecOps and things like that, there are certain ways that API gateways work in Azure and AWS and GCP. There are certain structural advantages that we have over the way these servers and services are constructed, to the extent that an ASPM can understand those, similar to how a CSPM does, and add an understanding of the code, the sources and the sinks and the vulnerabilities. Then there is room for somebody to innovate and create real value there. But I would be skeptical of anything labeling themselves out of the blue as ASPM unless I see something of real value there.
Yep. And the way that I've interpreted this over time is I think that the point about APIs and these cloud native solutions, the cloud platforms really helping there is really on the nose. I think one of the reasons that those sort of improvements have been able to happen is because we've taken elements of software applications, the application space, and we've pulled them into the infrastructure space. And at least this is my own layman's understanding of the dynamics of these different spaces. Is it seems like most things, I will not say all things, but most things in infrastructure are just way more deterministic. If X, then Y. Yet most things in the world of software are not that simple. And I think that's where tooling has really struggled to support. Because if it was just a bunch of some things are, use of insecure libraries or methods, or like certain insecure coding patterns that we know are going to be problematic. They may not be directly associated, like you could use the raw SQL stuff in Python to build a SQL query. And that might not be insecure, but it's certainly more susceptible to possible error if you are not sanitizing the inputs that go into it and all that good stuff. And so I think that's really where that line to me ends up coming into play is are we able to pull things out of this complex space of the software and into this more deterministic space of the infrastructure, where we can apply structured tools and kind of decision methodologies to it. And that I think is, that's an interesting evolution in the space as the cloud providers and these other technologies begin to pull out more of this complexity and make it make it deterministic in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a Kubernetes distribution or some resource that the cloud providers are building, or something that manages sessions, or data storage, whatever it happens to be. Like that trend, I think, is really, really interesting, and speaks to your comments about the need for security professionals to really be blurring their own lines and being able to move fluidly into and around all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day for AppSec is like where infrastructure can help too is like, how close are you to the source? How close are you to the sink? Like I found a vulnerability, great. How close is it to the source? How close is it to the sink? Where are the potential mitigations in this chain, if any, right? And that's a challenge for a lot of teams. And I think, one thing we haven't talked about too much yet, but I think is another sort of dimension to play here as we think about scale and getting it out to the rest of the organization is, what am I trying to do as a security professional, as a purple teamer? Am I trying to raise the floor for everyone, or am I trying to raise the ceiling for a few systems? And that's something that I think every security teams have to make so many decisions. I think one of the things, you read these stories about security fatigue, for security burnout, things like that. Like, there's a lot of hard decisions that security people have to make, where it's like, do you want to hit yourself in the foot with a hammer or hit yourself in the hand with a hammer? It's like, well, you're still getting hit with a hammer. That neither really sounds that good. And it's like, oh, I can limp for today, or I can, work with my left hand for today. Right. So, it's not always the case that you have perfect answers to these things, but one of the things I try to do from a decision standpoint is, there are certain sets of things like dependency scanning we talked about a couple of times. Like to me, a classic, let's raise the floor for everybody. Do not pass go, do not collect $200 without, making sure you can clear this check. And we feel like we know exactly what's in that list that we're blocking. And we feel like we know exactly what to do about it. And we're going to be 100 out of 100 on this. And like, those are things you can, small, medium, large organization, can roll it out. There are other sorts of things that require a lot of time. They require design or investment or special purpose tooling, because the Uber app works a certain way. Who knows what it is? And there are, in every organization that is successful enough, you have to be in a successful organization to have a security team at all, whether you're a successful enterprise or a government agency that serves a lot of people. Like, you've got a higher, even might not feel like it at the time, you've got a higher class of problems because you're in a successful organization. If you're in a successful organization, you probably have 1, 2, 3, something like that, some number you can count on one hand of crown jewel applications. And the answer for those crown jewel applications might be really going into like 10 times more analysis, because it's that important, because that ride, that person picking you up on the right side of the street is that important, as opposed to like crossing 6 lanes of traffic in LA or something, whatever that is. And so again, back to the blue team side of the equation is knowing which game am I in? Am I in a raise the floor game? Am I for minimally acceptable? Am I in a raise the ceiling game for like, I'm really going to try and turn everything up to 10 on this thing because it's a X here.
Yeah. Well, and that, I think that thinking deeply about the asset, understanding the asset, understanding the organization that the asset is in, the mission of the organization, what's important, how the organization makes money or delivers on its mission, depending on the organization type. That was one of the things that really jumped out to me about in the Substack you mentioned on DSPM, is unlike most security solutions that are outside in, this is one of the first things that is really going direct to the asset and working from the asset out. And that is really, I think, a useful thing. Like one of the talks that I saw in, I guess it wasn't that recent anymore, Man, every time I think that, I feel like I'm just getting old, but alas,
It beats the alternative.
that's true. One of the talks that I saw that has really it's stuck with me was this talk by Nathaniel Gleicher, and I believe he's over at Meta now, but at the time he was at Illumio, and the topic of the talk was basically what cybersecurity can learn from the Secret Service, and it was all about starting with your high value asset. Secret Service's case, they're obviously doing executive branch protection, and so they're protecting the president and the vice president, and et cetera. And so you start with that, and then you work in these concentric rings outside of or away from that high value asset, and you control and monitor and set choke points on the different pathways to get into and to the high value asset. And that talk ended up resurging in my memory as I read the Substack, and thinking about that asset first approach. And do you think that this is going to be a trend with security approaches and or tooling moving forward?
I hope so. I think it will take a while before it becomes the dominant. And I don't even know if it's appropriate for it to be the dominant approach to security, but I'm glad it's on the table, and I'm glad it's starting to be in the tool set. And you can go back to, like, an extreme example I always think of. Let's assume for a moment that somehow, some way, PGP and GPG email was like ready, easy to use, and like a billion people had PGP and GPG installed, know how to use it, and it was seamless. Like, the amount of controls that we spend, the amount of investment that the industry, the world spends on like securing email and networks to send email, and like so many things would fall by the wayside because, you've got authentication, you've got an encrypted message that's, signed and hashed and everything going across the wire. Like, you could send something from the most dangerous coffee shop in the world and to somebody else who's in the most dangerous coffee shop in the other part of the world, and you'd be fine, right? Like that. And it's kind of incredible, like how many hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars probably are spent on making everything in between point A and point B secure, where if you started with the asset. Now, that obviously didn't happen for lots of usability reasons, which is why I'm not predicting that like this is the start of a new age. But I do think that the focus on the asset has been lacking for a very long time. And we have, as an industry, almost sleepwalked into this mindset where we're always working from the DMZ in. And there's lots of good practical reasons why that was the case, but we missed so many opportunities. And I'm glad that DSPM is starting to see the uptake and interest that it has, and that any time spent over there, I mean, like on the right-hand side of a diagram where you're on the inside, close to the data, file systems, file structures, databases, that's just time well spent. Like, how are those databases locked down? What's the control stack looking like? Where's that data moving? Where is the sensitive data? Is it in the places you thought, or is it in some places maybe you didn't think that it would be? That's just so opposite how a lot of security teams spend 98% of their time. And yet that's probably where 78% of the risk is, right? Like, that's where so much of the risk is, on that side of the equation. So I do think, as much as setting the infrastructure, the apps, the users, the don't click this phishing link, like all these different things that security teams invest in, and rightly so, we miss the opportunity by losing track of the asset. And back to some of those earlier discussions we had of like, is this a place to talk about strength or scale or raise the ceiling or raise the floor? Getting really crisp and clear where those assets are and what the issues are, that helps you tune those decisions into the reality on the ground in a way that you can't really do without those scans and classifications in place of what the assets are.
One thing that comes to mind here is So you mentioned the comment around the industry kind of sleepwalking their way into an approach. I don't disagree with you. Do you think that there was any major causation to or reasons as to why that was? Was it sort of a collective kind of experience that we were all going through, and it just sort of became a cultural norm? Or do you think that maybe the overemphasis on compliance, mandates, and alignment for so long sort of
I think
instilled this behavior?
industries and technologies are a reflection of people as much as that the people who built them and the people who run them. And I think it's as simple as most of the people in security came up with an infrastructure and network background. And when they thought about security, they very rightly thought about securing the infrastructure and networks that they had built. And that is where that that the security capability lived in most of the organizations for the first, I would say, decade and a half of the internet. And it's only in recent years that it started to move into like, oh, maybe we should be maybe product security should be, I don't know, in the product security team. Right. It's really only in the last 6-7 years that started to come to come into question, like where should it be?
Yeah, or even hiring developers onto security teams and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I mean the security protocols, these unlike programming languages and unlike technology, where you have these products and tools that didn't exist, and then 2 or 3 years later they're everywhere, and then 2 or 3 years later they're gone and replaced by the next thing. Security protocols aren't really like that. Splitting the key was like 1978. Okay. And Kerberos was like 1990 or something like that. And then Active Directory is like 2000. Like these things are like decades long. So we're still, from a security protocol perspective, we're still standing on the shoulders of primitives that came out of 20, 30, 40 years ago. And those were built, Kerberos goes back a really, really long time. And that's, every 3-finger salute in the history of the world is the Kerberos transaction, right? So, so these things were designed for very specific reasons, and they had good reasons why they built them. And but I don't think that security as a discipline will fully reflect some of the opportunities that you talked about. Until we get enmeshed in some other teams, and I don't think we should leave the good things that were accomplished by the past aside. I'm not brushing those aside at all. In fact, I wrote a piece some years back, and I can send you the paper where we can put in the notes. Is the DMZ is dead and long live the DMZ is basically the point of it, and the point being like, here are the things the DMZ did well. And if identity is the new perimeter, what can we learn from the old perimeter? And, the old perimeter, the DMZ, was great at having a separate standalone place where the normal rules don't apply. That's fantastic security advice, right? Like that's almost, a one-sentence description of what we're supposed to be doing. But we didn't do it for applications in the DMZ. We didn't do it for anything other than network traffic, right? Like that's what those things were designed for. And when this, identity is the new perimeter or the cloud's the new perimeter, can you take those constructs that were good from the old world and apply them? And which ones do still apply? And I think some of them do, but
even if they look a little different.
Yeah. And then some of them will be like, we're in a new world and we need these are some things that we need to do better. And those would be things like, your golden builds, your ability to, deploy new code in, 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks, so that things don't live for very long times, ephemerality and those sorts of things. That's not something the network DMZ people ever really had to deal with. That's something that, AppSec can bring to the table, and it's very, very effective. And that I would say is something that could even be a raising the floor type of thing in certain large organizations. So like there are times when you can get these great wins. You just have to, be open to where they're coming from. And sometimes they're not coming from a security vendor, and sometimes they're enabled because of you have the right security vendor. You just have to figure out what that is. So you should be open to new design patterns and new ways of solving the problems, because we're operating in new areas.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, you need look no further than like this AI boom that is happening right now to even.
I hadn't heard about that. What's going on there?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So it's interesting with that. I mean, one thing I find really encouraging about the way that things are evolving there is it seems like with the Gen AI boom, we're unlike with other major advancements in the past, we are building and figuring out like industry certification. You've got like the ISO 42001, you've got the EU AI Act, you've got regulation and certification and all of this stuff happening alongside of, or at least like much closer to the advancement in technology, as opposed to those things just being way lagging. And that I think is it's really interesting. And I hope that stuff like that continues to be a trend in the industry. And that's not all security people driving that. That's regulators. That's a whole lot of people. But I see that as being a pretty encouraging trend.
I'm glad that it's on the table. And I think we have got better, almost probably starting with cloud, where at least security has been at the table and considered. The Cloud Security Alliance came pretty close to, 5 minutes after cloud started to get big. Cloud Security Alliance was right there. Didn't get everything right, but like it was there, right? Like, and I think that's been an encouraging improvement over the last 5, 6, 7 years, that security is brought to the dance very close to the beginning, as opposed to, with maybe the earlier days of the web, and maybe JavaScript would be a good example, where it's already widely scaled, and then security's like trying to get the horses back in the barn too late.
Yeah, we're being that.
Having said that,
dance trying to come up and figure out how to groove.
I do worry a bit about AI, in the sense that I think, back to my we're operating new territory standpoint, I'm not sure that people have fully grappled with the gaps of traditional security tools in AI, in the sense that, let's just take role-based access control, the old battle horse of information security from 1992 or whatever. It assumes that you have a structure, and you have a role, and you have a permission that you put on that role. Well, AI is developing this and generating the structure as you go. So I would posit that if you don't even know what the structure is, then how are you putting a role and a permission on that? And the answer might be role-based access control doesn't work. Fine. What's the other? Please tell me what the access control matrix is going to look like then. And, you can get fancy with attribute-based access control and policy-based access control, and we can talk about this for as long as anybody wants to. But the point is, AI is proceeding. It's not clear to me what the structure that any of the access control matrices are going to be based on has been thought out to any real degree.
Yep, for sure. So, all right. So I want to ask one final question as we kind of round things out. We've talked about everything from DSPM to developer engagement, to building AppSec programs, to big, broad, sweeping trends in the industry, and that's all fantastic and super interesting. And I can't wait to listen to this once I go in and get it all cleaned up and edited and whatnot. If you were taking on a mentee, or maybe like you're stepping into an organization in the future, and you need to start kind of getting your bearings, or you're recommending to somebody how they go about getting their bearings, what is the first, like, there's get your 90, your first 90-day plans in place, all of that stuff. I think, and that's all well and good, but you can't even get a 90-day plan in place if you don't get your bearings right out of the gates. Like, what advice would you give to somebody stepping in for like their first week or 2 weeks in terms of conversations they have, things that they try to learn, and who they try to start partnering up with?
Yeah, I mean, I would start with the key use cases, the key platforms, the key products that the business runs. So not the security use cases, not the security platforms, not the security products. I'd
Same.
start with, the business or organization use cases, products, platforms that you run, because back to leverage, which we talked about a while ago, leverage, you can get leverage as a security person by knowing the attacks better than anybody else. That's pretty hard to do. There's thousands of really good attackers out there. You can get leverage by understanding your security tools better than they do, better than others do. That's helpful. But if you're, I don't know, you're a healthcare insurance company, and you have a claim system, and like if that claim system goes belly up, you have a serious problem. Like, you should know that claim system better than anybody else should. That's one thing that you should know better than anybody else, and that will give you the mental model to then overlay what whatever level you've developed your red team skill set, your blue team skill set, or your vendors have. You'll be able to target and bring more precision to what am I trying to do with this service, the security capability, and locate it and ground it in reality, because it will look different depending on, I call it the law of strawberry jam versus the law of raspberry jam. Raspberry jam, you can just spread over a piece of toast and it's the same height all the way across the piece of toast. And sometimes you want that raspberry jam, and sometimes you want strawberry jam, and then you get those chunks of strawberries, those nice big chunks of strawberries. So it still covers the toast, but it's chunky. Those are your crown jewel applications. So know those crown jewel applications, at least the ones that are in your sphere of influence. You really need to know those things. And those are the things that probably consume 80, 90% of your developer resources. So those are things that you want to have much more than a passing familiarity with. And they're probably been the most heavily customized as well. So you're not going to just be able to say, I understand GCP, so now I understand this. It's like, no, how did we deploy this to build our healthcare insurance claims applications?
Yep. And I guess hopefully brief follow-up to that is, like, what sort of things are you trying to learn about those assets? Is it, how they're built, who depends on them, data flows? Is there like a top thing that you want to, or a top couple of things that you really want to understand from those? Because, the technology is all well and good, but I don't think the technology is really where I'm going to make an assumption that that's not where you're going to go.
Well, I like to start with identity structures and who's logging on and how. And it's always important to think about the user. Who are they? Do they work for you? Do they not work for you? Are they outsourced? Where are all the places they can authenticate? And then don't forget your privileged users. Who actually can update this software, and do they work for you? And where, how are they authenticated? So I think you can take an identity. Once you understand what the use case platform are, you can take an identity view, and it is something you can get in a day or two. You can figure this stuff out in a day or two. How are people signing on? Hopefully, and then who are they, and what are the permission structures? And again, don't forget the privileged users, because that's also you're going to learn a lot that way as well.
I love that. All right. Well, I wanted to say thank you, sir, for spending the last hour and change with me here. This has been a fantastic conversation, not so different than all of the other fascinating conversations we've had about everything from investing to security to culture and all the things in between. So I very much appreciate your time, your wisdom, and yeah, I hope we get a chance to talk again soon.
Thanks again, Robert. Really appreciate your time as well.
All right. Thank you for listening, everyone. And we'll be on again soon.